Thomas Merton, who was a Benedictine monk. He was born in Europe, but he died here in the United States. He spent a lot of time here. He had wrote many books about the spiritual life. Today the talk is about the parable of the prodigal son, and the father welcomes us. So before we look at the parable, which is found in chapter 15 of the Gospel of Luke, we just need to first find kind of in the context, where is this passage found in the Gospel of Luke. First we have in chapter 14, so the chapter prior to chapter 15, we have St. Luke inviting the members of his church, his community, and the readers to think what should be their attitude about that's required to be part of the church, to be part of the community. And in chapter 15, it's something different. What he's asking his reader and the people of his church, he's asking them to, how do you deal when you have the situation that someone has left the church and now someone wants to come back to the church? How do you welcome them? And as you know, the parable of the prodigal son, which is the third one, is linked. There's two other parables that's there in this passage. The first one is the well-known one about the lost sheep, that very often when you go for a first confession, you always see the kids, you see Jesus, and then the kids go and take like a little lime and then they put it on something. This parable is found both in the Gospel of Luke and also in the Gospel of Matthew. But they have different endings, but it's more or less the same thing about reconciliation. But in the Gospel of Matthew, it's much more about that we don't need to offend the little ones. And then we have the second parable in that chapter 15 that speaks to us about the woman who lost one of her coin. And this passage is, sometimes we know that she loses it and she finds it. As the first one for the shepherd, the person of the shepherd is for us, we all know that this reminds of Jesus, the good shepherd who carries the sheep, the sinner. The second one is the image of the church. So this is the image of the church who seeks and intercedes. Unfortunately, we don't sometimes think of, when we read that passage, to see that it's actually the church, because we know that the church is always portrayed as a woman, because we hear that on the Easter Vigil when we say the church gives birth to her children, and we know that men cannot give birth, but it's a woman who gives birth. So now let us look a little bit at first, what is a parable? Kind of a small definition. A parable is a succinct didactic story in prose or verse that illustrates one or more instructive lessons or principles. It's different from a fable where you don't have people being involved. Whereas in parables, you have human beings are always being involved. But here what you have also with the parable, as it says, you have more than one way of understanding. It is not just like a parable means only one thing. Because if you read through the centuries, many church fathers, they have written about this parable. One of the earliest church fathers, St. John Chrysostom, saw the two sons. He saw the first son as the angel and the prodigal son, the one we call the prodigal son, as human beings. So each one interprets it in a different way depending on our situation and in our time in the world. Sometimes when we hear the word prodigal son, we all know that the word prodigal son means someone who has left the family and comes back. We all say that this person is the prodigal son or prodigal daughter. But the word prodigal itself means someone who spends money or resources freely and recklessly, someone who is very much extravagant with his money. So in a way, when we look at that son, that's what he did. He spent his money recklessly, but also he was the one who came back. So sometimes we call this parable as the parable of the prodigal son. But in the Bible itself, we don't have any title. Some people also have called this parable the parable of the lost sons, because we may think that only one son was lost, but when you really look at the parable, you find out that both sons were lost. And sometimes it's referred to as the parable of the forgiving father or the loving father. So it all depends on which person we put an accent on, kind of which one if we focus much more on the father or the part of the father, then we could call it the forgiving father or the loving father. If we focus on the son, the first one we call the younger son, we call it the prodigal son. Or if we focus on both sons, we could call it the parable of the lost sons. And we hear this parable in the church. We hear we use this passage of the parable of the lost prodigal son on the fourth Sunday of Lent, year C. So next year you will hear that on the fourth Sunday of Lent, which is Laetare Sunday. But also we use that on the 24th Sunday of Ordinary Time, year C, because it's from Luke. But when we hear that on that Sunday, we also hear the two other parables with it. It's also used in various times in the church, especially when we have confessions or when you have a Mass for reconciliation or for the votive Mass for the Sacred Heart, because it reflects the mercy of Christ. And in the Eastern Church, in the Eastern Orthodox churches or the Eastern Catholic churches, they would use this passage of the prodigal son 2 weeks before Lent. So when the people hear that passage, they know that in a couple of weeks, Lent is starting. The story that we have in the prodigal son is not something that's just in the Bible. There's something in the Buddhist literature, in the Lotus Sutra of the Mahayana. The two parables seems to be very similar. They have a lot of similarities, but the interpretation and the way that it's portrayed is slightly different. We have kind of the same story, but different interpretation and different endings. Some of you may have seen, there's a famous picture of painting of Rembrandt that has, it shows, for example, you have that picture where you see the father embracing the son, the prodigal son, and at the back you have the other son, and also you have some other people, sometimes depending on how you see it. And this is one of the things. And also you have a book that was written by Henry Nouwen. It's called The Return of the Prodigal Son. And he uses this parable to talk about his own conversion. So you may want to take this book and maybe use it. And also Pope John Paul II used this parable in two of his main writings. He used it in his encyclical Rich in Mercy in 1980, and also he used it in the 1984 Apostolic Exhortation, Reconciliation and Penance. So if you want to go back and if we have some time, I may read a few things from there, but depending on time, we will see how it goes. First, I would just want to go kind of first listen to the reading, to this parable in a literal sense. I'm not going to read it the way that it's written, but just kind of to have a sense of how we can interpret that in the literal sense. Because as you know, the church interprets the Bible into different senses. So in the literal sense, what we have is we have a father that has two sons and who has a lot of possessions. The young son, as he was of age, came to his father and said, give me my inheritance. So the father divides the inheritance, gives the son what he has, then he collects everything and goes to a different country where he is spending everything, where he is really the prodigal son, where he is spending money in a very extravagant way. Then he loses everything. Then he says, I need to have a job. As we all know, if you don't have any money, no friends is helping you. Now you need to find something to help you. And he finds a job feeding the swines. And there he realizes, he comes back to his senses and kind of thinks, oh, life was better at my father's house. So he says, now I will go to my father and tell him, forgive me for what I have done and hire me as a worker. And before he reaches the place, the father sees him. He's the first one who moves towards him, embraces him, and then there is a celebration. Then we have the second son who comes into the picture. He doesn't really like what's happening, and then the father has to go out, pleads with him, and the son has that conversation with the father, kind of trying to tell the father, this is kind of not a good thing. You are not being logical, kind of try to get back this wayward son of yours. But the father wants a real reconciliation. So now we're going to look kind of briefly about how I have some interpretation of this parable. So what I'm going to do is not to give the whole thing at the same time. I'm going to read from the scripture passage, then to give a slight interpretation, and then we'll just kind of do that and then try to wrap something at the end to try to put that I'm going to kind of rewrite that passage in a context, in our own context, and see how each one of us deals with that. Tax collectors and sinners were drawing near to listen to Jesus, but the Pharisees and scribes began to complain, saying, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. So to them, Jesus addressed this parable. So here we have two groups, the tax collectors, the scribes and the Pharisees. We have the scribes and the Pharisees, and then we have the tax collectors who are called sinners. And later Jesus will use in that parable that the father has two sons that reflects these two different groups. And as you know, the scribes and the Pharisees did not eat with people that they thought were public